One of the most commonly used and well-known examples of the evidence for evolution is that of the horse. An intensely studied and incredibly well-represented group of animals, the journey of the equids from small, forest-dwelling multi-toed browsers to the large, grazing single-toed inhabitants of open landscapes is something that anyone who has been taught anything about evolution will likely have heard before. But the story is so much more complex than this. A remarkable variety of prehistoric horses are now known to science that paint a much more intricate picture of how exactly these animals came to be the way they are today. And this is what we'll be exploring in this video. Horses are often used as exemplary models of evolution for a reason. The record of evolutionary transition of these organisms has been well documented for a while, since the time of Darwin himself. In fact, Darwin was astonished to find a tooth from an extinct horse when visiting Argentina during his famous voyage, which was one of the first hints towards the true origin of these animals. In the 1840s, paleontologists began to realise that North America was an important place in the history of horse evolution, since extinct members of the living horse genus Equus were appearing here in the fossil record. However, it was the British biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, known by many as Darwin's bulldog for his strong support of Darwin's theory in public debates, who in 1872 came to the conclusion that a link between all the prehistoric horses known from Europe at that time could be made, starting with a group that lived in the Eocene called the Paleotheres, now known not to be equids, and continuing all the way to modern horses. But it was then in 1876 when Huxley visited the US and was invited by the paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh of the infamous Bone Wars to view his fossil collections at Yale's Peabody Museum. Here, many specimens of prehistoric equids ranging in time from the Eocene through to much more recently were examined by Huxley, and after discussing with Marsh realised that, in fact, the evolution of the horse had taken place mostly in North America, with only a few lineages escaping into Eurasia a few times in their history. These American horses, according to Marsh, showed a sequence of so-called progression from the earliest small 4- and 3-toed forms through to the big-bodied 1-toed forms that closely resembled modern Equus. Later, during his visit to the States, Huxley was due to give a lecture in New York on horse evolution, and after seeing this new evidence had to revise his material. He even asked Marsh to produce a figure illustrating his sequence of horse evolution, resulting in the first example of this famous march of progress towards Equus. It was therefore largely Huxley who was responsible for popularising this view of horse evolution as a clear linear progression through time, although other scientists such as Marsh had contributed significantly to this understanding. Since then, horses have been utilised as a nice, simple example of evolution in action in all sorts of places, from museums to biology textbooks, with the various transitional forms very conveniently displaying the gradual changes in anatomy that occurred over time to give rise to the modern animals. However, as with many things, it turns out that it was a bit more complicated than this. Life's little joke, as paleontologist and well-known science writer Stephen Jay Gould called it, is that the reason we draw this simple linear progression through the horses is because of how unsuccessful, in terms of diversity, they are today. Compared to the rest of their history, when multiple different genera were coexisting with each other for millions of years, modern horses are truly the last of their kind, with all the horses, zebras and asses contained in just one genus, Equus. So this is why the view of evolution as a ladder is able to be made to fit the horses, since, from our perspective, it looks as though they were always evolving with a goal in mind, the singular Equus. However, this is not at all how evolution really works. It's true that a single line could be traced from Eohippus through to modern equids, but this gives a warped perception of evolution and ignores a great deal of the true complexities involved. As Gould points out, even at the time of Huxley and Marsh, there were indications that the story of horse evolution was much more complicated than this, since Huxley himself had been investigating European forms that had originated from North America and represented separate branches of the lineage that never left any living descendants. Instead of a simple ladder, the true evolutionary history of equids was much more like a bushy tree, of which Equus is the sole surviving twig. In addition to this oversimplification of a bush into a straight line, the ladder view of horses also obscures the fact that the rate and mode of their evolution varied a great deal. The ladder portrays this evolution as if it were always a gradual accumulation of changes over time that caused one species to change directly into another, a type of evolution called anagenesis, when in fact there would have been a lot of cladogenesis as well, speciation due to splitting off or branching of populations that then become distinct from one another over time. This means that, as I mentioned already, there would have been times in the Earth's past when several equid genera were coexisting alongside each other, instead of one taxon just turning into another and replacing them. So we've established that horse evolution was much more of a complex bush than a straight line of progression. Now it's time to explore this bush and the various different lineages it contains. But before we get to that, what even are horses? Horses are members of an order called Perissodactyla, or the odd-toed ungulates. This grouping of mammals was far more diverse in the past than they are today, with the surviving members being the equines, rhinos and tapirs, but prehistoric members including such clades as the Chalicotheres, Brontotheres and the giant Andrikotheres, some of the largest terrestrial mammals to ever live. The name odd-toed ungulates comes from the fact that, at least among the modern members, these animals bear most of their weight on their third toe, with the rhinos and tapirs possessing 3 digits on each foot and modern horses possessing just 1. This is unlike the conditions seen in the artiodactyls, or even-toed ungulates, animals such as deer, pigs, cattle and many others, in which their weight is supported by 2 toes on each foot. And there are of course many other anatomical features that support the relationship between the perissodactyls, such as their methods of digesting cellulose. So the closest living relatives of horses are the rhinos and tapirs, but what about their prehistoric relatives? Within perissodactyls, horses are included in a suborder called Hippomorpha. This grouping includes 2 other notable taxa, the previously mentioned Brontotheres and another group known as the Paleotheres. Brontotheres, members of the family Brontotheriidae, generally look much more like rhinos than horses, but many researchers place them within the hippomorphs as close relatives of the equids. This group is made famous by taxa such as the massive Megacerops, which was very rhino-like in appearance but with Y-shaped blunt nasal horns on its snout. These horns have been suggested to have been utilised in intraspecific combat, especially since the horns are much larger in males, and a particular specimen actually preserves a healed broken rib that's thought to potentially be due to wrestling with another Megacerops. The Brontotheres were around for quite a while, living from 56 million years ago at the start of the Eocene all the way to the end of it about 34 million years ago, but unlike the equids, they left no surviving members. However, interestingly enough, like the equids, they've actually had their own evolution portrayed as a ladder, this time by the infamous Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History. In the early 20th century, Osborn promoted the idea of Brontothere evolution being a progression from small, hornless forms through to the giant horned beasts that lived later, whereas in fact, much like horse evolution, it was far more complicated than this and with many different branching lineages, but that's a story for another video. The other important group of hippomorphs is Paleotheriidae, the research history of which is actually very closely intertwined with the horses. The Paleotheres lived throughout Europe and Asia from the early Eocene about 55 million years ago through to the early part of the Oligocene, 33 million years ago, and were mostly quite small, forest-dwelling animals, though some species actually grew quite large and managed to reach sizes comparable to modern horses. The Paleotheres were actually some of the very first prehistoric mammals to be scientifically described, when in 1804, the famous French naturalist Georges Cuvier examined a specimen and determined that it must have been some kind of ancient tapir-like organism. Then, as I mentioned briefly before, Huxley considered the Paleotheres to represent the earliest record of equids in Europe, and in fact these animals have been confused with the earliest horses many times in the past, but they're no longer considered to be included within Equidae. The taxonomy of the Paleotheres has been deeply entangled with the earliest equids too, with the genus name Hyracotherium long being considered a valid name for the first known true equid. However, the type species of this genus was later re-examined and realised to actually be a Paleothere, meaning that the genus Eohippus is now the valid name for the earliest member of the horse lineage. Still, often you will see things referring to Hyracotherium instead of Eohippus, but this is quite out of date. The interesting thing though is that although the earliest traces of horse evolution undoubtedly occurred in North America, and this continent was arguably the most significant place throughout their evolutionary history, there are indications that the equids originated in a very different place. The true equids appeared in North America about 56 million years ago, but where had they been before this? Well, some researchers think that there may be some good evidence for the immigration of equids into North America directly from Europe, across land bridges that once existed at this time. The evidence for this comes from the fact that although the Eocene equids known from Europe are much younger than the North American ones, they're relatively much more primitive, or basal, in a lot of their anatomy. This is particularly notable in the feet, since the North American equids appear to already be slightly more specialised for running than the European forms, hinting that these European animals had descended from a more ancient stock that once existed here, some of which had then travelled over to the Americas. But even further than this, where did the equid ancestors come from before Europe? Although there's no direct fossil evidence to undeniably confirm this, some reasonable assumptions can be made. It seems plausible that either the ancestors to the equids originated in Africa before taking part in a faunal exchange with Europe that allowed various other groups of mammals to spread into this new land, or that they originated in India. However, the current lack of good fossil material means we cannot be certain where they first came from. But despite this murky ancestry, it's clear that the first proper equids to appear were in North America, with creatures such as Eohippus, the dawn horse. This animal lived from around 56 million years ago through to about 50 million years ago, during the early Eocene, and, as I've already mentioned, has had a confusing taxonomic history, resulting in there being a lot of outdated information about this organism. Eohippus was certainly a small animal though, standing between 25 and 45 centimeters tall at the shoulder, with a fairly short neck and snout and an arching instead of straight back, and potentially lived much more like muntjac deer than modern horses. Famously, Eohippus possessed 4 toes on its front feet and 3 toes on its back feet, and the vestigial remains of the other digits were still present. Additionally, the teeth, which were in the formula common for browsing mammals, were quite low-crowned, and many of the bones in their legs were still unfused. On all of the functional digits were small proto-hooves, and the feet would also have had cushioning pads on the backs of them. Eohippus fossils have been found in various locations across North America, and have played a very important role in discovering the history of this remarkable lineage. However, the taxonomy of the earliest equids gets even more confusing and controversial, as although it now seems clear that Hyracotherium should not be used to refer to the true first North American horses, various different genera have been named for the specimens that were once known as Hyracotherium, but these have also been argued to potentially be invalid, as the differences in the specimens may just represent individual variation within a taxon. Another one of these very early equids, which is currently a valid taxon but might just be the same thing as Eohippus, and is potentially slightly older, is Sifrippus. Also known from North America, and specifically well known from the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, Sifrippus would have looked overall quite similar to Eohippus. Interestingly, it appears that these equids went through a period of shrinking during the time they existed, decreasing in weight from about 5.6 kilograms to just 3.9 kilograms, before then increasing again to about 7 kilograms. These size changes seem to be directly correlated with the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a period of significant global warming, with a decrease occurring over the first 130,000 years of this event and the increase happening during the recovery phase. This is a fascinating response to climate change that's amazingly illustrated in these ancient equids, and actually follows something known as Bergmann's rule, which states that closely related species or populations of a species tend to be smaller bodied in areas or at times with greater ambient temperatures. Another very early equid, but this time known from Europe and Asia, is Propaleotherium. As its name suggests, this genus was originally thought to have been a paleothere, but more recent studies have been able to determine that it was actually a true equid instead. Incredible fossils of these animals have been recovered from the Messel Pit, a quarry in Germany with rocks dating back to the Eocene 47 million years ago. These amazing specimens have even preserved gut contents, which is always an invaluable resource for paleontologists as it enables the diet of these ancient creatures to be determined. In the case of Propaleotherium, leaf fragments and fruits, seeds and pollen were identified as having been consumed by this animal, with researchers concluding that these equids were more accidentally rather than selectively acquiring their food, possibly by scavenging through leaf litter. As mentioned previously, Propaleotherium and several other of its European relatives possibly represent a branch of the equids that descended from the more ancient stock that lived here and that remained in Europe, while another branch travelled across to North America and gave rise to the later horses. So, after the suite of very early equids, which includes many taxa other than just Eohippus, Sifrippus and Propaleotherium, we come to the younger Eocene North American horses. During the Middle and Late Eocene, it appears that equid diversity was somewhat reduced, as only a few taxa are known from these times, compared to the large number of early Eocene forms. The first of these younger equids was Orohippus, another horse with historical significance in working out the evolution of the group, as this was the earliest equid used by Marsh in his famous ladder figure. Orohippus was another equid that looked overall very similar to Eohippus, first appearing about 50 million years ago and also being known from localities in North America, such as Wyoming and Oregon. Like Eohippus, it was small, with an arched back, short neck and short snout, though the snout had lengthened slightly compared to Eohippus, and it retained 4 toes on its forefeet and 3 toes on its hind feet. These toes would also have had pads on them. Additionally, the lower limb bones were still unfused in this animal. However, unlike an Eohippus, the vestigial outer toes on its feet had been much further reduced and were pretty much absent, although the reduction of digits 1 and 5 is something we'll come back to later. Another crucial difference that's been noted between Orohippus and earlier equids is in the teeth. In Orohippus, the fourth premolar had changed to be much more like the molars, enabling the organism to have an extra grinding tooth, and the actual tooth crests were larger and more pronounced, hinting at the tougher plant material these browsing equids were feeding on. Then, around 47 million years ago in the middle of the Eocene, the equid Epihippus appeared. Again looking very similar overall to Orohippus and Eohippus, the main differences can be seen in the teeth of this animal. Instead of only the fourth premolar being shaped like a molar, like in Orohippus, in Epihippus both the fourth and third premolar were more like molars, giving this equid even more grinding surfaces with which to process food. A very poorly known taxon that only lived for a relatively short time was Haplohippus, known from specimens unearthed in the US. Often this genus is ignored in texts on horse evolution, but in an effort to attempt to portray the true bushiness of evolution, here it is. Other than the fact that this animal was similar in ways to Orohippus, not much is known about it, but its existence demonstrates that the evolution of this lineage was certainly not as linear or tidy as many make it out to be. 40 million years ago, still during the Eocene, the first species of Mesohippus suddenly appears in the fossil record. This was a larger animal than older taxa such as Epihippus, and looked fairly different too, with a less arched back, longer neck and legs, in addition to a lengthened snout. Interestingly, fossils of this genus indicate the presence of a shallow depression on the skull known as a fossa, which in many equids that lived later actually became quite a complex structure. Significantly, Mesohippus was the first record of a fully tridactyl equid, with just 3 functional toes present on both fore and hind feet. However, the feet still would have had pads on them. Other differences to older taxa included the fact that, based on studies of brain endocasts, the cerebral hemispheres had become much larger and looked more like they do in modern horse brains. Plus, the last 3 premolars had changed shape to look like molars, with all later equids possessing this arrangement of 6 teeth used for grinding. The crests of these teeth were similar to the condition in Epihippus, being adapted for grinding down tough vegetation, and a lot of these anatomical changes appear to have been driven by selection pressures resulting from the changing climate at this time, as it got drier and the forests that were once spread across North America began to decrease in size, with grasslands becoming more common. Mesohippus was also the first member of a lineage of equids known as Anchitheriinae, a diverse subfamily of prehistoric horses that we'll be encountering more of later. A long-held idea about the evolution of Mesohippus was that gradually over several million years, this genus then directly evolved into the genus Myohippus by anagenetic evolution. This was due to the fact that, looking mainly at the teeth of these equids, which are the most commonly found fossils of these animals, there were not that many differences in their anatomy. As a result, the separation between taxa was simply said to occur at a particular stratigraphic boundary. However, work by paleontologists that used much more complete remains of these animals discovered that, in fact, Myohippus split off from an earlier species of Mesohippus by cladogenesis instead, and various species within the 2 genera actually coexisted with one another for a good few million years before the last Mesohippus went extinct, as is demonstrated by a locality in Wyoming where 3 species of Mesohippus and 2 species of Myohippus have been found together. The genus Myohippus was generally larger in body size than Mesohippus, in addition to possessing a relatively longer skull, with an even larger fossa and an extra crest on the upper cheek teeth, a characteristic feature of the dentition in younger horse species. Other anatomical differences have been identified too, which help to better define the split between this genus and Mesohippus. The Mesohippus genus met its end sometime in the middle of the Oligocene epoch, and for a while Myohippus seems to have been the only equid genus we know of that was left, until the start of the next epoch, the Miocene. This apparent period of low equid diversity has been referred to as the Oligocene bottleneck by some writers, but they also suggest that this bottleneck might not actually reflect the reality of equid diversity at this time and instead be a result of bias in the fossil record, with it being possible that future discoveries might reveal new taxa that fill this gap. It is worth noting though that the genus Archaeohippus may have appeared right at the end of the Oligocene, but the stratigraphy is not fully resolved. Anyway, Myohippus appears to have been the start of another complex period of radiation in equids, with multiple speciation events occurring near the start of the Miocene that resulted in several different coexisting equid lineages. As I mentioned, both Mesohippus and Myohippus are members of a subfamily called Anchitheriinae, a diverse lineage that actually became quite widespread around the world and contains many different genera. This lineage obviously didn't survive until the present day though, and as such is considered a side branch of the evolutionary tree of equids. But there lies another problem with our concept of horse evolution. What counts as a side branch and what counts as the main branch? Sure, you could consider the lineage that leads to the currently surviving members as the central line, but that's not how evolution works. As I explained earlier, there's no predetermined goal in evolution, so it's only with the benefit of hindsight that a misleading main branch can be identified. Another genus of Anchitherian that evolved possibly towards the end of the Oligocene or at the start of the Miocene was the previously mentioned Archaeohippus. Now, one of the most notable evolutionary changes that's often quoted as occurring gradually through equid evolution is, of course, the overall increase in body size over time. However, Archaeohippus is a brilliant example of why this oversimplification can be so misleading. These animals were significantly smaller than the equids they coexisted with, representing a lineage of so-called pygmy horses. Other members of this group include the genus Caelobatypus, an equid notable for its remarkably elongated legs due to lengthened metapodial bones, in addition to the taxon Anchitherium, after which the grouping is named. The genera Megahippus and Hypohippus are North American taxa potentially derived from an Anchitherium radiation, and were notably large in body size for the time at which they lived. But interestingly, Anchitherium did not remain restricted to North America, as fossils of this genus have also been found in early Miocene-aged rocks in Europe and Asia, representing the first instance of equid dispersions out of the New World and back into the Old World across the Bering Land Bridge, an occurrence that actually happened multiple times over the course of horse evolution, as we'll see. The dispersal of Anchitherium appears to have been the start of an Old World radiation, as the Anchitherian Sinohippus then appears in the fossil record, a genus known to have lived in Asia, before also migrating into Europe, but not known from North America. Sinohippus was another fairly large-bodied equid for the time, however it is not known from particularly good fossil remains. Sinohippus was the last of the Anchitherians to survive, going extinct in the early Pliocene about 3.6 million years ago. All the members of Anchitheriinae still appear to have been adapted mostly to browsing diets, even the notably large genera, with their relatively more low-crowned teeth. They're also considered to have probably lived in forested habitats, and all possessed 3 toes on their feet. Moving back in time a bit, another Anchitherian that appears to represent the lineage from which modern horses derived is the genus Parahippus. This equid lived during the early Miocene and was larger than Miohippus, but was not reaching the sizes of the big-bodied Anchitherians. The changes in this animal's teeth are especially notable, with a series of crests that had developed in the dentition and taller crowns. This is the radiation from which the grazing, plains-dwelling equinae evolved, another remarkably diverse lineage that includes the modern horses as well as a wide variety of fascinating extinct forms. Now, I haven't seen it discussed anywhere in the literature, but since modern horses are descended from a lineage within Anchitheriinae, then surely they should be considered surviving Anchitherians. Otherwise, Anchitheriinae is a paraphyletic grouping, a condition where not all the descendants of a group are included within it, since equinae seems to have derived from a lineage within Anchitheriinae. Anyway, just something to think about. As I said, I haven't actually seen this talked about anywhere, but it's interesting. Another period of radiations occurred as the equines began to appear in the early Miocene, leading to some pretty complex evolutionary events that get quite messy and complicated around this time, but I'll attempt to summarise them. After Parahippus came another very significant genus, Merychippus. The classification of these animals has been quite complicated, and for a while it was considered a Merychippine grade, essentially an assemblage of many different taxa that all looked quite similar but were not properly distinguished. However, the taxonomy is now a bit more clearly defined, though since there were so many speciation events going on around this time, it's still been a challenge for paleontologists to work out exactly which lineage derived from which. The genus Merychippus contains many different species within it, but generally these animals were relatively tall for equids of the time, with an elongated snout, deeper jaws and eyes positioned further back on the skull that gave the creature's heads a much more horse-like look. Changes to the brain also occurred in this taxon, becoming larger than in older equids. Variations in the sizes of the side toes are also seen in the Merychippus genus, being larger in some species but much smaller in others, though they were all primarily using the enlarged middle toe, which was supported by a very strong complex of ligaments running underneath the fetlock. Merychippus therefore seems to have been adapted for running quickly over hardened ground, and the fact that their teeth had notably higher crowns with a series of complex crests indicates that this genus was probably grazing on grasses in addition to occasionally browsing, the earliest known equid to have done this. As I've already alluded to, the burst of speciation events around the time Merychippus lived were pretty complicated, but this so-called Merychippine radiation gave rise to another new era of immense equid diversity, with 3 main lineages of grazing horses appearing. The first of these was a radiation that gave rise to the clades called Hipparionini. The Hipparions were another diverse, wide-ranging group of equids with a fascinating biogeographical history, as they are another example of horses migrating from the New World to the Old World in various waves. It was more towards the end of the Miocene when multiple waves of Hipparions dispersed across the Bering Land Bridge into Asia, Europe, and eventually even Africa. The genus Hippotherium, known from across Europe, the Middle East and Asia, is interesting due to the fact that recent work shows it seems to have partially returned to a browsing lifestyle, showing just how diverse this lineage was. The genus Hipparion itself also seems to have been the first equid to enter Africa, around about 10 million years ago, in addition to being present in Europe at the same time that the Anchitherians we met earlier were too. Additionally, the genus Neohipparion is known to have lived quite far south in the New World, as fossils of this genus have been discovered in Central as well as North America. The Merokippine radiation also resulted in the evolution of the Equini clade, the group that includes modern horses, as well as many more fascinating extinct lineages. Within Equini, another side branch, though as I said before this term is a bit misleading, was Protohippina, a grouping including two genera, Callippus and Protohippus. These taxa were again relatively small equids for the time they lived, with Protohippus reaching the approximate size of a dinky donkey, showing once more how the supposed trend of increasing body size over time is only apparent when a very particular line is drawn through the evolutionary tree. Callippus is also an interesting genus due to the fact that it seems to have had a particularly extensive range to the south in the New World, like certain Hipparions did too, with fossils of this Protohippine being known from Honduras. Another member of Equini was the grouping Equina. Yes, the names get very confusing, but they are all different. And again, this is the even smaller subgrouping that includes modern horses. Within Equina, there were both three-toed and one-toed horses, and it seems that a reduction and in some cases eventual loss of functional side toes may have occurred independently more than once, about 3 times in fact, as far as we currently know, though it may have occurred a 4th time. One of the taxa included within Equina was the genus Pliohippus, which was for a long time thought to be a contender for the direct ancestor of modern Equus, but more recent studies have found this to be unlikely. A number of distinct anatomical differences between Equus and Pliohippus exist, including deep facial fossae in the skull of Pliohippus, a feature we discussed before that is very useful for classifying ancient equids, but that is missing in modern horses, as well as much more strongly curved teeth in Pliohippus compared to Equus. A grazing plains inhabitor, looking at various Pliohippus fossils, it's also possible to see a reduction in the size of the side toes over time. Another lineage within Equina gave rise to the genus Hippodion, the first equid to make it into South America. Appearing in the fossil record about 2.5 million years ago, in the late Pliocene to early Pleistocene, it's not certain if this taxon actually originated in South America itself, or whether it evolved in southern North America before migrating further south during the Great American Biotic Interchange, but once it was in the southern continent, it appears to have thrived. Hippodion was fairly small compared to living horses and had an overall look comparable to a donkey, though a particularly notable feature of the equid is the long, narrow, extended nasal bone, which some researchers have suggested indicates the presence of a lengthened and flexible snout. The equine also possessed strong and short fetlock bones, seemingly an adaptation to inhabiting the mountainous regions of South America. The exact relationships of Hippodion to other members of Equina has been heavily debated, with some initial ancient DNA analyses suggesting that the genus might be close enough to Equus to be included within it, but then other research finding that they were indeed very distinct animals. There is also some disagreement as to whether this means the genus originated from the Pliohippus lineage or if it might have evolved within the Equus lineage, but we'll discuss that more later. Either way, the Hippodion lineage was certainly a fascinating part of the evolutionary history of this incredible group. Moving back to North America and back in time again to the Middle Miocene, we see the genus Astrohippus appear in the fossil record. Astrohippus was another one of the lineages in which the side toes independently became reduced over time, though it's possible this genus is actually derived from Pliohippus itself. Also in the mid-Miocene of North America, the genus Dinohippus appeared. This was another lineage in which the side toes became reduced independently, and seems to be the radiation from which Equus originated. The exact evolutionary relationships of Dinohippus to other equids is fairly complicated and has been heavily debated, but studies have found species of the genus to be closely related to sections of the Equus radiation, and many consider this taxon to be representative of an intermediate between Pliohippus and Equus. Dinohippus was very common throughout the Pliocene of North America, and displays many interesting features that hint at its relation to modern horses. These include shallower facial fossae on the skull compared to older equids, less curved teeth, and the first instance of something known as the stay apparatus, an arrangement of bones, muscles, and tendons that enable horses to lock their legs and enter a light sleep while standing. There was also an interesting variation in how many toes were present within this genus, since it seems that some populations of Dinohippus possessed 3 toes, while in others the side toes had become reduced. After Dinohippus, the classification and relationships of equids gets very complex again, with a lot of recent work having been done to try and properly define what is even included within Equus. Another genus that seems to be representative of the transition between Dinohippus and Equus is called Plesippus, and despite for a long time being considered synonymous with Equus, recent analysis has placed it as a distinct taxon. A related genus that was also revived in the same study is Allohippus, also known as the Stenon zebra, which spread into Eurasia. The exact boundaries of what counts as Equus is still undergoing revision, and it changes depending on what classification criteria are used, meaning this is therefore an unclear area of equid evolution. However, based on genetic analysis of the oldest horse to have its genome sequenced so far, it appears that the last common ancestor of all living horses, zebras and asses originated between 4 and 4.5 million years ago, though other studies give varying values around this date. One of the oldest known examples of an animal which may or may not be Equus is the famous Hageman horse, the state fossil of Idaho. Technically known as Equus simplicidens, this species has had a delightfully confusing taxonomic history, and might not actually even be within the Equus genus at all, instead potentially being a species of Plesippus according to the research that resurrected this genus. Assuming for now that the Hageman horse is a species of Equus, the oldest fossils of these animals date back to around 3.5 million years, and indicate that these horses were fairly basal in their skull features, being described as zebra-like in their overall body shape but with a donkey-like head. The Equus genus quickly dispersed into the Old World not too long after their origin in North America, with the species Equus levensovensis being known from fossils found in southern Russia and western Europe. This species seems to have been closely related to the Hageman horse, but was larger in size. An Old World radiation of Equus quickly occurred, with many different species and subgenera being classified. One of the first lineages to branch off was the subgenus Asinus, the group including the African wild ass, and therefore donkeys, the Asiatic wild asses, and the Kiang. This ass lineage is most closely related to the zebra lineage, and together the two groups form the non-Cabaloids, whereas the true horses, domesticated horses, Przewalski's horse, the tarpan and others, form the Cabaloids. Data gathered from mitochondrial DNA analyses supports this distinction of the living Equus species into two groupings, as well as the classification of the zebras as a natural grouping that's all derived from a common ancestor which lived in Africa about 2.8 million years ago. The taxonomy of Equus species in the New World is a bit of a complicated mess, but what's new there really? In the past, all sorts of species and subgenera were named for the various fossils of Equus found across North, Central and South America, but more recent investigations, particularly studies using molecular methods, have found that there are only a few different lineages of equid present, and some genera that were considered distinct may in fact be included within Equus. One of these lineages is one that used to be known as the New World stilt-legged horses. These animals, recently given the genus name Harringtonhippus but then subsequently being found to be synonymous with Equus in a paper published 2 years later, were for a long time considered to be descended from a group of asses from the Old World that migrated back into the New World. However, it turns out that they were in fact endemic to North America, and very closely related to Equus ferus, the species from which domesticated horses are derived, according to some research. In addition to Equus ferus and the stilt-legged horse lineage, there's also the issue of classifying the South American Hippodion, which we met earlier. A lot of recent work has focused on trying to determine the origin of this group, and as I briefly explained before, one idea was that they evolved from Pliohippus, but newer research seems to favour the grouping of Hippodion within Equus itself, possibly being derived from the stilt-legged horses. Another South American equid that appeared during the Pleistocene was an animal given the genus name Ammohippus. However, again, more recent mitochondrial DNA analyses have found these horses to most likely be descended from a lineage of Equus ferus that entered the continent and adapted to new environments, illustrating how incredibly adaptable and plastic the Equus genus is that so many taxa once thought to be distinct based on their morphological differences have turned out to potentially be species placed within it. There's a lot more that can be said about Equus ferus itself and the groups which eventually became domesticated, but we'll discuss that in more detail in part 2. Despite the success of the equids in North America, eventually they all became extinct in the New World during the Quaternary megafaunal extinction, with only the populations of Equus ferus that spread into the Old World surviving, and then of course eventually being reintroduced to the New World with the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. The cause of this extinction, and indeed the Quaternary extinctions as a whole, is still an area of heated debate and could be a whole video by itself, but most researchers and evidence favours either the changing climate or overexploitation by humans as the primary cause. So that's a not so brief overview of known horse evolution from Eohippus to Equus, but there's still much more to look at with the history of horse domestication, which we'll investigate next time. Before we end the video though, I just wanted to quickly explore a few more interesting details of equid evolution that I think are worth investigating. First, Cope's rule. What is Cope's rule? Well, it's the idea that, in general, lineages of organisms will evolve to become bigger over time. A great deal of research has been done on this subject, with it seeming to indeed apply to some lineages, but not to others, and the evolution of horses was long considered a prime example of this rule in action. There are many benefits for a lineage to get bigger over time. Research has found that larger body size can increase the chances of survival and reproduction. However, it seems that an increase in diversity is what's being observed in horses. Instead of the slow increase in size from Eohippus to Equus that's so often illustrated in the misleading ladder view of evolution, there's no evidence that Cope's rule was taking place in the equids. Large body size occurred multiple times independently in some groups, and a decrease in body size was widespread among these animals too, as we've seen. Both big and small equids were coexisting with each other at many different points in time, and therefore the increase in diversity and the fact that only Equus happens to survive today has led to this skewed view. The supposed trend of increasing body size over time as equids evolved brings us to the next point. The trends so commonly quoted as occurring in this lineage, reduction in the toe number, gaining of higher crowned teeth, an increase in size and lengthening of the face, are not consistent across the horse evolutionary tree. They only appear to be present when the single line following the ancestors of modern horses is traced. But like I keep saying, this ignores so much diversity and paints a truly misleading and unrepresentative picture of the equids. As we've already seen, the apparent trend in body size doesn't apply to all equids, and another example is the reduction of the toes. Most of the horse genera that lived relatively recently in geological time were actually animals with 3 toes, and it only looks like the one-toed condition was some sort of trend or even the end goal to us because only the one-toed lineage survives today. And this brings us to another point. Why did the one-toed condition, known as monodactyly, even evolve in the first place? Often the primary reason for this condition to have evolved is said to be because it's a more efficient construction of the limbs for a fast-running adapted animal. Looking at things from a purely energy-saving viewpoint, reducing and eventually losing the side toes while strengthening the middle toe is incredibly beneficial and efficient for the locomotory mechanism of these animals. However, recent research has put more emphasis on the transition from pad-footed to spring-footed equids as being the more significant change. I mentioned many of the earlier equids as having feet with pads on them, meaning their feet were raised up onto the tips of their toes due to the presence of fatty pads behind the digits which would have acted as shock-absorbing structures. However, somewhere around the point that the Anchitheriine Parahippus appeared, the so-called spring-foot condition had evolved in the equids, and the start of an ungular-grade posture in these animals can be seen. The spring-foot condition is the construction in which the foot is supported by a complex series of tendons and ligaments which acts to reduce the impact of forces caused by the animal's running and, amazingly, through the actions of stretching certain flexor tendons, actually stores elastic energy and therefore saves a good deal of locomotor energy when the foot touches the ground, which is then released again when the foot is pulled up, leading to a very efficient system. All members of the subfamily Equinae, the Hipparionini, Protohippina and Equini lineages, possess the spring-foot condition, but it was then only in Equini that monodactyly evolved. It's therefore interesting that, although Equini, and Equus itself, was incredibly successful during the Pliocene and Pleistocene, truly the most diverse and widespread of these groups throughout most of the Neogene as a whole were the Hipparions, which all still possessed 3 toes on their feet. Recent work investigating the origin of monodactyly states that any explanation for this condition therefore must be considered in the context of why it did not appear in the Hipparions. As such, it offers 2 hypotheses. Either monodactyly is just a secondary circumstantial occurrence that is not adaptive and happened due to an increase in locomotor efficiency in respect to elastic energy storage, or it was due to differences in the foraging behaviour of equini and differing locomotor gait selection pressures during climatic changes of the late Miocene that triggered the evolution of the one-toed horses. It's some fascinating research and an interesting discussion to have, and again illustrates just how much more there is to find out about the evolution of this remarkable group. A final interesting aspect of equid evolution is the case of chestnuts, ergots, and frogs. Chestnuts are callosities on the forelegs and sometimes hind legs of certain equines, while the ergots are callosities sometimes found on the underside of the fetlock, and the frog is a V-shaped structure present on the underside of the hoof, as you can see on Jack here. Many ideas have been considered as to what these structures actually are in relation to the evolutionary history of the equids, and they're worth quickly investigating. First, chestnuts. These are present on the forelimbs of all equines, on the inner leg above the knee. and in most domestic horses as well as Przewalski's horse, they're present on the hind limbs too, below the hock. However, they're missing on the hind limbs of both the asses and the zebras, another indication of their close relation to each other. The most common explanation you'll find for what exactly chestnuts are is that they're the remains of the vestigial outer toes or wrist pad, although other explanations have been thrown around, such as vestigial scent glands. But the toe explanation doesn't make a lot of sense, considering they aren't associated with the metacarpal or metatarsal bones, which are the only locations in which digits occur, and it really seems that no one is quite sure what they are. A similar explanation has been given for the ergots, which are much more variable in their occurrence, sometimes being present on all four limbs of an equine, sometimes on a few, and other times lacking completely. The suggestion for these callosities is that they represent all that remains of the vestigial sole pads, but again, no one seems to be certain. The frog, the V-shaped structure on the underside of the hoof, is a shock absorber and actually has a very important function in the circulatory system of equines too. This structure is highly elastic, and when it makes contact with the ground as the foot is placed down, it actually pushes up on a flexible mass known as the digital cushion, causing it to compress the veins present in the foot and forcing blood to be moved up the leg. Then, when the foot is lifted, blood flows back into the veins, resulting in the hoof functioning as a pump. But what is the frog? Is it actually a remnant of a vestigial toe, as has been suggested but seems unlikely for the chestnut and ergot? Well, some recent research suggests that it might actually indeed be formed from the remnants of two vestigial digits. In a paper published in 2018, researchers found that there may be evidence for all 5 of the digits still being partially present in the forelimb of modern adult horses. It explains how, traditionally, it had been thought that in addition to the main digit 3, the central weight-bearing digit, there are also 2 much reduced splints of bone present in the foot that represents digits 2 and 4, the side toes. But it then goes further and proposes the remnants of digits 1 and 5 are actually present in modern horses too. These digits are considered to be expressed as ventral ridges of bone on the digit 2 and 4 splints, as well as being represented by bony wings and cartilage associations projecting backwards from the hoof. Interestingly, this pattern of digit reduction is therefore almost hourglass shaped, in the fact that all of the digits are expressed at the top and bottom of the foot, but in the middle only the third digit is present. So where are digits 2 and 4 expressed at the bottom of the foot? Well, this research proposes that the frog actually represents the partially differentiated second and fourth digits. Using comparisons with extinct species, as well as comparisons with other living perissodactyls, rhinos and tapirs, and the anatomy of the frog itself, there's some good evidence and reason to believe that this structure does indeed comprise the remnants of these digits, as such a structure is absent in ancient equids and other perissodactyls that have fully formed second and fourth toes. So, yet more exciting recent developments in the study of equid evolution that shows how much more there is to find out. Hopefully I've managed to do a decent job at hinting at the true complexity of evolutionary processes with this not so brief review of horse macroevolution, although as with all attempts to summarise the evolution of this lineage, I've had to make simplifications and omit details to avoid this video going on forever. Plus, this is still an area of active study and not all the relationships between taxa have been fully resolved yet, so future discoveries may have significant impacts on what has been said here. I found it interesting while making this video to note how often I've been drawn towards, and had to stop myself writing, a distorted but simpler summary of equid evolution that focuses on the main players of the group's evolution from Eohippus to Equus, and ignoring the so-called side branches. Of course, this is exactly what has happened many times in the past, and is the reason why we humans enjoy using the simplified ladder view of horse evolution as an ideal example of this process, even with there not really being such a thing as a central branch with side branches coming off it. And it's only with the benefit of hindsight that this false pattern can be discerned. Another thing that surprised me while researching and writing this is just how unclear a lot of equid evolution is. Despite these animals having been used as the prime example of evolution for so long, there's still a great deal we don't know about the details, and there's a lot that still needs to be discovered and clarified about these incredible animals. It's an exciting prospect to think about what future discoveries might be made one day. As I already hinted at, in part 2 we'll be covering the history of horse domestication, picking up where we left off this time. There's still so much more to discuss, so do look forward to that video. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed part 1, and a big thank you to our patrons, especially our Dinosaur Tier supporters Greg Silvernail, George Vojtek, Persian Boy, Mike Pace, Mayer's World, Dhruv Shrivastava, Matthias Bergshire, Amanda von Nordek, Just F. Max, Laura Sanborn, Bella Anderson, Harry Evert, and Alain Bally. If you would like to find out more about our world, its history, and the wonderful life that surrounds us all, please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you think we deserve it, and if you would like to see more from us.